Is this for me or is this for...
That's for C-SPAN.
For C-SPAN. Okay, I'm really sorry I'm late. Broke down in Fort Wayne. Saw a lot of cops on the way in, but they didn't stop me. So I deeply apologize, and thank you so much for sitting around for an hour talking among yourselves about the Clinton scandal, probably. I passed a sign in Indiana saying, fed up with the scandal, eat hamburger. I'm of the school that Clinton, if ever there was a fake populist, it was Clinton. He hasn't even aspired practically to fake populism. But here he is, in a way, being saved at the moment by a genuine populism of people saying to the elites, saying sex is private and who cares. I think it's a glorious moment in American history myself. If only to see George Will's face night after night. The CIA was the topic of the book that Jeffrey and I decided to write not long after Gary Webb got eviscerated by the press after his disclosures in 1996, almost exactly 2 years ago, August 1996, about the Contras and drug smuggling. Have you had Gary here, by the way, of people? Yes. You have had Gary here. So I won't go deeply into what he said. For those who weren't here, I'm sure you're familiar with the essential charge. And what interested Jeffrey and me originally was the way, when you step out of line, athwart the line of mainstream discourse, for want of a better word, in the American press, mainstream. If you cross a certain line, you get done. We've actually seen a couple of cases this summer in the form of Mike Gallagher, who wrote an incredible series of pieces in the Cincinnati Enquirer about Chiquita Banana, previously known as United Fruit Company. One of the best series, actually, on a multinational corporation that's ever appeared in mainstream American journalism, or even on the left. It was a brilliant, brilliant portrait, for which assiduousness and tenacity, he was immediately fired and run out of the profession. Fired under the accusation that he'd got telephone conversations, to which the answer is, he says he got them from a source, but so what? One of the distressing features of it was the speed with which his colleagues turned on him. Not a very nice profession, my one. Because in Gary Webb's case, his colleagues turned on him, including his own editor and his own colleagues at the San Jose Mercury News. If you're going to go in, you like solidarity in your business, don't be a journalist, at least in the mainstream. And then, of course, we saw this summer the case of April Oliver and Jack Smith, who did a piece for CNN on the Tailwind's use of sarin in Laos, for which documentary, actually they did an hour and it was cut to 18 minutes, and then they were accused of missing things out. They were, of course, fired and kicked out. So you've had all these cautionary tales, and that's what interested Jeffrey and me. Cautionary tales where there are certain areas you can't approach in American journalism without getting into deep trouble. One is assassination. If you start saying that CIA actually have used assassination as a method of national policy for many years, you get into trouble. You get into trouble if you start kicking too deeply into the drugs business. And of course you get into trouble if you start saying that major American corporations subsist on thievery and exploitation on an unlawful international scale and appear to have conversations to prove it. As I used to say when I started in journalism, comment is free and facts are expensive. But as Jeffrey and I sort of went through how Gary was done, we found ourselves really beginning on the parable of journalism and mainstream journalism and what can be said and what can't be said. We found ourselves getting more and more into the history of the CIA. And it crossed our minds that it was about due for another introduction to the agency. Some of the older people among you, like myself, were probably introduced to the agency in '68 with the disclosures in Ramparts magazine, now marching under the rather limp guise of Mother Jones, that the CIA had deep sponsorship of the National Student Association. That was one of the first big disclosures. There had been courageous souls who'd written earlier about the CIA, but that was when it really went public. And that really launched a whole decade and a bit of public disclosures about the agency and a learning of what the agency had been up to. If there's one omission that I think damaged Gary Webb, it is that he didn't really cite, and of course when you're doing that kind of end of journalism, you know, you want to really say, your paper always wants to say they invented the bicycle. You don't want to say that there were previous inventors of the bicycle and people had even learned to ride bicycles. And you want to, you know, it's our bicycle, we made it. Here it is. Webb didn't really invoke, which he could have done, the fact that there's been an enormous amount of work, there had been, of brilliant investigative work about the relationship between the agency and drugs and drug trafficking. Back in the 70s, by the early 70s, Allen Ginsberg was in Yale one time, the late Allen Ginsberg, the poet, and was chatting with a young student called Al McCoy and said, you know, who was studying Southeast Asian languages, and said you ought to really get in to the relationship between the agency and drugs in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And McCoy went away and wrote one of the most brilliant books on this subject ever written, and certainly the most courageous, or one of the most courageous, which was The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. Fantastic book, which was thoroughly trashed at the time. The agency tried to suppress its publication at Morrow Books, failed, and the book was reissued in a second edition in 1991, and I strongly commend it. We do an extensive account of it in our book. There was John Marks's book, again based on, well, this time based on Freedom of Information Act documents, not very many of them, about the search for the Manchurian Candidate, about the CIA's effort at mind control, its sponsorship of enormous number of experiments to do with LSD, hallucinogens, and other potions and pharmacological mixtures, many of them of a lethal nature. And of course there were the Senate investigation chaired by the Senator Frank Church of Idaho, and a House investigation run by Otis Pike. By the end of the 70s, therefore, there was a pretty full account, a lot of documentation about the coups that the agency had sponsored, some account of the assassinations it had tried to perpetrate, notably, of course, Fidel Castro, but also Lumumba, its complicity in the murder of Lumumba, and other attempts. The 80s were far more fallow. And really, although there were massive inquiries in the late 80s into the relationship between the agency and drug running, particularly Senator Kerry's investigation, and through the 90s there hasn't been that much, and it struck us as it was time to remind people of what the agency has really been about. We were recently chided in a review appearing in The Nation, a kind of policy wonk review by someone called Joanne Kaywell, for launching ad hominem arguments against the agency. It's the characteristic of policy wonks. They don't like violence in language. Ad hominem. I never thought I'd be accused in The Nation of being ad hominem about the CIA, but there it is. And the first skein of our book, well, the first skein is really the press and web. The second skein really is why has there always been, from day one of the agency's existence, absolutely day one, a relationship with drug trafficking? I mean, do people, when they join the agency, say, I really want to run drugs? Does it come to them naturally, or is it just part of their function? And the preface really comes in the Second World War, when the predecessors of the CIA, notably the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services, That's normal, huh? Oh. But commenced a relationship with mobsters for 3 reasons. 2 had to do with the New York docks. They were worried about sabotage because of the U-boats in the Atlantic, and they wanted the cooperation of the mob. That was one reason. The second reason is they were, I think, far more worried about labor organizing by Harry Bridges, who was leading the charge for the longshoremen, the non-mob-dominated longshoremen against the ILA. And the intelligence agencies contacted Meyer Lansky and said they were looking for cooperation, and also they were looking for cooperation in finding sources in Sicily that could help them in the invasion, which was being planned. At that time, Lucky Luciano was what they used to call the mob kingpin, if you like, and he was doing 30 years in Dannemora prison in upstate New York. In fairly short order, he contacted Luciano. Luciano was moved to a nicer prison. Dannemora is a very rough place indeed. And had his sentence commuted and was deported to Italy, where, in the waning years of the war and the beginning of the peace, he started building and rebuilding his drug empire on an international scale. Now, if you had a CIA man sitting right there, he would probably say, they could say, well, you know, that was the national interest. You could make a case for it. I think the important thing, probably downplayed, would be the need to crush the left on the docks in New York, but almost immediately thereafter, the agency, its first major task after it was founded in '47, was to confront the possibility of legal victories by the Italian and the French communists at the ballot box. The agency, desperate for money, and money is another source of relationship with drug trafficking. Remember that money from drugs is, you know, not officially registered money. It's what you might call black money or illegal money or covert money, unaccountable money, very importantly. The agency then renewed its ties, or continued in its ties, with the mobs in Marseilles and in Italy, and right-wing organizations. The agency at that time, at the dawn of the Cold War, was on the cutting edge of the war against communism, the war against socialism, the war against the left. Who are your enemies going to be in such a war? They're going to be labor unions, organizers, the communist parties of various countries, national liberation movements. Who are your allies going to be? They're going to be para-fascist gangs. They're going to be right-wing dictators. They're going to be the propertied classes, in a fairly seamless web, which you will see repeated again and again. The relationship with the drug gangs is structural. And particularly when you get into what you might call narco regimes, such as, for example, the Taliban, such as the Salinas brothers. Some of you may have seen a story in the New York Times, actually, not so long ago, by Tim Golden, which actually now reveals something we sort of say in our book, particularly about Raul Salinas, that family, the father of the Salinas brothers, the former president of Mexico, and his brother, the father had been in a tie with Mexican drug lords when the Salinas brothers were kids. This is a long, long-term relationship, which evidently must have been known to the agency. Was known to the agency. Anyway, so therefore, right from the beginning, it is not a fortuitous one-time off we had to get arms to the Contras. Every time we had to support Chiang Kai-shek against Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek, even when he was still in China before the war, was doing much of his business, earning much of his revenues from opium management in what became the Chinese People's Republic. And when he was run out by Mao, his forces moved down towards the Golden Triangle and took over the opium trade there. The CIA was supporting Chiang Kai-shek. It was a fairly logical development for CIA planes or of organizations related to the CIA, beginning with Chennault's Flying Tigers originally, to start flying the opium. That story led, as the decades progressed, to when the CIA was trying to recruit the tribesmen in that area to work for them against the communists and the National Liberation Front, the Hmong, their relationship with drug running continued. You had CIA planes running the opium back into Laos and Thailand, where it was refined into heroin and then went into Vietnam. The motive, the Cold War rationale. The same thing happened at a later date in Afghanistan. In the late 80s, a regime, the Taraki regime, this was before the Soviets invaded, the Taraki regime in Afghanistan, a reforming regime, tried to inaugurate land reforms, confiscated the opium-growing estates of the feudal lords of Afghanistan. This was immediately seen by the CIA as a threat in the area. It drew lurid scenarios of, you know, the Soviets being able to rush in and then gain their long-desired warm water port, and so forth. The Soviets, of course, did ultimately invade, and the CIA then launched its largest ever operation, cost them over $3 billion in the end. They were fighting to restore the status quo ante. Their objective and actual allies were the opium lords. Much of the fighting by the people who were called, of course, those days Mujahideen and freedom fighters, there's some confusion now and a rather rapid transition to terrorist in a sort of gray area where one day it's terrorism and the next day it's freedom fighting and the third day it's the Unical project to run a pipeline, which of course is beyond freedom fighting and terrorism, is just purely about money. The Taliban was the eventual consequence of all this, which has now conceded by the US government to be vying with Burma and occasionally ahead as the leading supplier of heroin. The crisis began with how to support the Contras. The Boland Amendment forbade military supply of the Contras. In fairly short order. It began, by the way, for those who feel sentimental about Jimmy Carter, with Jimmy Carter whistling up Argentinian torturers to help form the Contras. Then there was the congressional cutoff, and in 1982, as emerged earlier this year, it was a smoking gun, actually. We could have, well, I'll have an aside later on smoking gun theory. Complicated. The whole, in journalism, when the hunt for the smoking gun is an important moment, as with Nixon in Watergate. They kept saying, remember, there was no smoking gun. I mean, usually at that point there were thousands of smoking guns, belching smoke. And they said, but no real, you had Nixon, you know, ordering the invasion of Ellsberg's shrink. You had, you know, bribe money being given to the burglars to keep quiet. But they said no real smoking gun. And finally, of course, the tape surfaced, and that was the smoking gun. In this case, they've always said there's no smoking gun with the CIA. And drugs. Well, the smoking gun earlier this year surfaced actually courtesy of the Inspector General of the CIA, Fred Hitz, who admitted in Congress that in 1982, Casey, the late William Casey, a true monster actually, even by the rather low standards of directors of the Central Intelligence Agency. There is a sort of gradation in monsterdom. I suppose there was a left of the Nazi Party when you think about it, in some sense. But Casey went to William French Smith, the Attorney General, Reagan's Attorney General, and said, we want a waiver so that we do not have to report drug dealing activities of our assets. A waiver he was immediately given. The correspondence was published recently by Maxine Waters' office, woman Maxine Waters. A waiver was issued, which was only rescinded, by the way, in 1996. Why 1982? The CIA at that time was gearing up for the arms drugs Contra shuffle, and they needed the clearance, which they duly got. We end that particular skein of our narrative with Mexico, where, as I just said earlier, you have the US knowingly in alliance with a narco-trafficking regime. As the Swiss police inquiry, which is really why all this has suddenly emerged, because the Swiss police who have built a case against Raúl Salinas and have been interviewing a lot of mobsters and drug runners incarcerated in various countries, including this one, concluded, and it was reported not so long ago, Raúl Salinas was in overall charge of making sure that drugs from the Andean countries made their way safely through Mexico, where he extracted, of course, an enormous price for that, 10% of the value, and passed on to the United States. This was the blue-eyed family, much loved by the US business and journalistic elites. Indeed, Carlos Salinas, after he was run out of Mexico, was still able to rejoice in the fact that he was a director of the Wall Street Journal, which I believe he is to this day, although they may have finally flushed him down. There is another skein in our book, which is the nature of drug wars. Well, one of the prime, commonly believed to be a tremendous fight to prevent the trafficking and consumption of drugs, which is an idea you should, I think, disabuse yourselves of immediately. Drug wars are either to ensure that the drugs are trafficked. You fight a war to make sure the drugs are moved in the direction you want them. The classic example is the two wars fought by Britain against China, known correctly as the Opium Wars. In the 19th century, when the Chinese empire, in its declining decades, did not want opium from India to be imported into China by the British. The British thought it was a splendid idea, from which they'd make lots of money, so they said, we will. And they fought two wars and prevailed. And delivered a very, very large amount of opium into China. And were only finally forced in 1920 by international opinion to stop doing it. Many of what are now the most respected names in British business life, like Jardine and Matheson, began their lives as opium traders out of Hong Kong. So wars are fought to ensure that drugs are moved. You could actually argue in some ways the Afghan war was like that, because the Afghan war restored the ability of the feudal lords to move their opium. The Taraki regime had tried to eradicate opium growing, just as the Mossadegh regime in Iran in the early 1950s, overthrown the CIA coup, was also trying to wipe out the drug growing. These are wars fought to make sure, and you could argue that many wars in Latin America have the same intent. If you want land reform, the enemy of any CIA director or any US government, which might heighten the power of peasants, you attack peasant organizing, and you hand the regime over or ensure it's run by thugs and gangsters, who, of course, are the narco-traffickers. A second purpose of drug wars is, of course, social control. And I would argue, certainly in this country, the prime motive now. And again, we trace that history back into the 19th century, when, for example, in the 1870s, when there were abundant Chinese laborers in this country, particularly in the West, building roads and railroads. In the 1870s, when there was pressure because of economic recession against them, because they were thought to be taking jobs away, there was immediately a ferocious attack on them for opium consumption. They smoked opium. Simultaneously, the middle classes were taking a lot of opium, but they were taking it in liquid form as tonics. I mean, I can remember growing up in Ireland, tonics survived quite robustly, as a matter of fact. My grandmother was always taking something called Dr. Collis Brown's patent medicine, transparent liquid, which is essentially liquid opium. She took with great gratification. That was one of the early examples of social control, and you can follow that thread through the 20th century, fought with increasing ferocity. One of the demonic figures here is Harry Anslinger, head of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, who was was a violent racist. He was as malign and awful a figure as as J. Edgar Hoover, actually, of the FBI, but not nearly so well known. In our newsletter, Counterpunch, we just ran an interesting piece about Anslinger by a guy called Doug Valentine, who did the best book on the CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam, its campaign of assassinations. Anslinger was always intent on heightening the so to speak, racist rhetorical impact of drug war fighting. He renamed hemp marijuana to try and associate, or try to popularize the name rather successfully to associate it with Hispanics and Mexicans. He launched savage raids and arrests on black jazz musicians in particular and sportsmen. And in association with Congressman Hale Boggs, for those of you who like to think of these lineages, the father of Cokie Roberts, and of the chief Democratic lobbyist on the Hill, Tommy Boggs, Hale Boggs, who disappeared over Alaska, actually, never to reappear, put through, in the 50s, the first mandatory sentencing for drugs, when the first death penalty, call for the death penalty, was all sponsored by Anslinger. The drug war was most pithily expressed, if I could just read out the quote, if I could borrow the book, by Richard Nixon, actually. When speaking privately, Nixon always had a very helpful frankness about him, I've found. He really, some presidents, even in private, had the need to wrap it up, but old Dick just didn't. He said it like it is, and it's worth finding the quote. Haldeman, page 73. As he was pondering the initiation of his drug war with Haldeman, Haldeman noted in his diary in 1969 after talking with Nixon, quote, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Very helpful little quotation. While not appearing to. And really from there, you know, it's a pretty straight line with the drug war to what we now have, which is an astronomical prison population with an incredible imbalance of black and Hispanic people, largely courtesy of course, the crack and powder cocaine imbalance in sentencing of 100 to 1. Which really cracked off was, for those who like to feel there's a bipartisan government at work, really pushed through by Tip O'Neill in the mid-'80s. Tip O'Neill, oddly enough, a big proponent of the Boland Amendment on the one hand, but O'Neill came from Boston, and there was a huge, huge uproar when Len Bias died, and it was attributed to crack. O'Neill thought they could get ahead of the president at that time, ahead of Reagan, by putting in savage laws. They vied with each other, the White House, the Reagan White House, and the Democrats on the Hill, to which could do the most savage laws and sentencing structures. And the result is more or less what we have now. There were efforts by the U.S. Sentencing Commission not so long ago to say this imbalance between powder and crack cocaine, the one much more used by middle class, the crack cocaine, of course, used by the poor. There's no rationale for it. Sentencing should be the same. This call by the U.S. Sentencing Commission was rejected by Reno's Justice Department, by the Congress, and by Bill Clinton in a ratification of a drug war as racist, and selectively racist, of course, as the original first war against the Chinese. I actually, the drug war now is so deeply embedded. Every now and again there's a call to end the drug war. It's now so embedded into the economies of law enforcement that it's hard to imagine it being I come from Humboldt County in Northern California. When I left, we are approaching the peak of our production of, not me, but many of my neighbors, of marijuana. And of course, the campaign against marijuana production camp is also in full tilt. In fact, the day I left, I saw 3 helicopters from the local cops. And the new wrinkle this way is the cops now hang from a rope underneath with their foot through a loop, moving 100 feet above the ground, looking down to see the plants. But, you know, their budgeting depends on the dope they find, and then with that budget will come more money into a fairly depressed area of California, and, which means more building and means more cars for the cops and so forth. Multiply this in every jurisdiction and you get, and then put on top of that the enormous lobbies now in every state, for, the prison lobby, prison building lobby, the waters lobby, you know, these are vast lobbies now. In a way, consequent upon the drug war. So the drug war is going to be a very hard thing to stop. That is the second theme. The third theme really is a theme which kind of is the core thought, I think, of the book. The essential continuity, in some ways, between the Nazis and Nazi methods and methods of state repression picked up in the Cold War. We say right up front in our book that very often people talk about a rogue agent or a rogue agency, the CIA. It's sort of comforting in a way because it implies, of course, that the ship of state is moving in a dignified and legal fashion while the sort of pirate ship of the CIA is swerving about doing all the dirty work. It's not the proper way of thinking of it, I don't think. We say essentially the CIA is carrying out, as a bureaucratic organization, the commands of government. Right from the word go, of course, if you go back and read the original founding document of the CIA, written by Clark Clifford, there's a slight gray area. And there always had to be a gray area. You could not have it requisitioned on paper from JFK, please kill Fidel Castro tomorrow morning. But as you follow this through, there is abundance. There's been, of course, a lot of work in particular about the campaign of the Kennedy brothers to have Castro assassinated, that the fingerprints are slightly more clear than usual. It's a bit more difficult, for example, to track it down with the murder of the Diem brothers in South Vietnam or Lumumba. But the CIA is not running athwart US government policy. It's part of government. And it's helpful to remember that and not delude oneself with talk about a rogue agency. The essential continuity might sound a rough way of putting it, but we spent some time in this book looking at the efforts of the US intelligence agencies, initially Army Intelligence, OSS and the others, and then the CIA, to bring out the Nazi scientists and take full use of their experiments and their researches as carried out in concentration camps. Some of the vilest, there's some very good work, again, been done on this, particularly by Chris Simpson. Some of you may have read his books. The vilest doctors, the most appalling criminals, were brought out, protected, relocated, and their researches carried forward. Again, of course, in the name of national security. But we're talking not just about, of course, now LSD, which was, that came a little bit later in the 50s, but they were looking very closely at all the experiments in mind control, which the Nazis were very interested in the various concentration camps. And the CIA's Technical Services Division, headed by a man called Gottlieb, Sidney Gottlieb, whom we have a whole chapter about, took full measure and full account of this Nazi work, as did all the researchers into chemical and biological warfare. This particular skein, I think, is well resumed in the figure of Klaus Barbie. Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was much sought by the French at the end of the war. US intelligence, military intelligence actually found him, or he found them, after an unpleasant experience at the hands of the British intelligence organizations. And they debriefed him, protected him, and eventually had him shipped to Bolivia under a new identity. This has all now been thoroughly documented, where he became, and here you have a lot of the threads of the book joined together. He became a CIA asset, one, a security advisor, i.e. expert in torture techniques and security techniques for the various butchers and thugs running the Bolivian government. For example, he was associated with the hunt to capture Che Guevara. And finally, he, of course, was in close cahoots with the big drug smuggling gangs. Bobby is a very symbolic figure. These are the themes of the book. Now, what are we not saying? We're not saying that if there hadn't been a CIA, there would be no drugs in America, clearly, which The Nation magazine accused us of saying. It would be a lunatic thing to say that. There's a drug market, and it's not caused by the CIA. Although some people, actually, like Levine, a former DEA man, they argue, which is something we don't in our books, that at some points, CIA supervised cocaine from Latin America was a very, very large part of the imports. I don't know, we don't say that in our book. We're more interested in showing, really, the agenda of the state. If the agenda of the state is the preservation and support of right-wing thug regimes abroad, and the maintenance of social control at home, which means control, supervision, and if necessary, imprisonment of the dangerous classes, that if that is the agenda of the state, then we can follow through how that agenda was carried forward. That's the way it happens. If it wasn't the agenda of the state, there'd still be drugs, but the atmosphere might be different. There might be different emphases. Not the insane emphasis on punishment, maybe more emphasis on counseling. Someone said to me, are you saying there's a secret organization supervising drug trafficking in this country run by the government? I said, yes, absolutely. It's called the Federal Reserve. Why? You could argue, taking a longer look, that the Federal Reserve sets, in large measure, economic, not totally, but responsible in large part for economic policy, and from economic policy flow riches and prosperity for some, poverty and misery for others. But with poverty and misery comes a rise in drug consumption, comes an increase in the need for some form of employment by desperate inner-city black youth, with maybe the only career opportunity at that point being crack running or whatever. So you can, if you want to, you can blame the Federal Reserve. But the agenda of the state is what counts. And that brings us full circle back to the press. Is the press just like the CIA, never rogue? Not entirely. It's a more subtle relationship. I think we've seen between Webb and now just how tight the reins are. This is not to say there aren't many courageous journalists who have done wonderful work in exposing the narco-trafficking realities in the last 10 years, last 20 years, whether it be Al McCoy, or actually I should invoke my own brother Andrew and my sister-in-law Leslie Coburn, who did some very spectacular documentaries in the middle 80s. And there are others, Bob Parry and Brian Barger, working for AP in the middle 80s, did spectacular work. There are people, honest US government employees, the DEA's Cele Castillo, and others, who tried to protest and tried to bring the reality. But the press, the mainstream press, has exceptions, but the tendency will be to protect and conceal. That's the tendency. You can't make an absolute rule. Someone's accused me of insufficiently theorizing the role of the press and the relationship between the press and the CIA. Well, it's hard to theorize, but you can get the drift of it with a couple of quotes, which maybe I'll give you, if you'll bear with me. Katharine Graham. Now, Katharine Graham, as you know, the heroine of Watergate, the chairman of the Washington Post Company. Now, in 1988, Graham told CIA recruits, quote, "We live in a dirty and dangerous world. There are some things the general public does not need to know and shouldn't. I believe democracy flourishes when the government can take legitimate steps to keep its secrets and when the press can decide whether to print what it knows." Well, as a robust statement, it lacks sort of muscle, but the implication is very clear. When the press or the people running the press or owning the press think the state agenda requires it, keep your mouth shut. The other is from a guy called Keith Schneider, who was working at the New York Times at the time of the Kerry report, which the press almost totally ignored. Kerry report, you might think, rather, it wasn't just Gary Webb. This was of the San Jose Mercury News. This was a full press investigation by a senator and a large committee. Came to, after prolonged inquiry, came to conclusions, not so far from Webb's, and almost totally ignored. Then Schneider had done for the New York Times a 3-part series dismissing allegations of contra-drug trafficking, and then in these Times magazine asked him why he'd done that. And he said that such a story, i.e. to ratify that the agency had been in bed with the traffickers, could, quote, shatter the Republic. I think it is so damaging, the implications are so extraordinary, that for us to run the story, it had better be based on the most solid evidence we could amass. Which really means you'd have to have a signed statement from the Director of Central Intelligence saying, we did it. We did it and we're proud of it. So there. People often say a reading. I always hate to read my books because, I don't know, I feel people might fall asleep. But I will read the last paragraph. As the CIA turned 50 in 1997, it attempted to define its role in a world no longer containing the Soviet Union. What it came up with was a plan to combat something it had done so much to encourage over the first half-century of its existence, international crime. Among the CIA's proposed targets for preserving its slice of the $27 billion intelligence budget were money laundering, illegal immigration, drug smuggling, and chemical and biological terrorism. Only 3 years earlier, the CIA was still enjoying an exemption from reporting the drug activities of any of its associates. If they were alive to read the CIA's prospectus for the third millennium, the ghosts of Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Chiang Kai-shek, George Hunter White, Barry Seal, and thousands of others would surely have laughed at the effrontery of their old partner in crime. So I'll stop there and maybe we can have questions. Thank you.